Big Shaq thought he had left his past behind, until he found the man who built his future, forgotten on the streets. Coach Gerald Tate, once a legendary mentor, had been erased by the system. But Shaq wasn't about to let the man who shaped him disappear. Fame, fortune, and power were on the line. But some battles are worth losing at all. What he did next? Unbelievable. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The streets of Los Angeles hummed with life, a restless energy pulsing through the veins of the city. The sun hung high, casting long golden rays over the towering skyline, while distant car horns and laughter blended into a chaotic yet familiar symphony. The air smelled of street food, warm pavement, and the salt of the Pacific carried in by a soft breeze. It was a city of dreams, a city of illusions, where a man could be everything one day and forgotten the next. Big Shaq, as the world knew him, walked these streets with a quiet presence, his massive frame drawing eyes, but his demeanor humble. He had lived many lives here, the struggling kid, the rising star, the champion, the businessman. Now retired from the game that had made him a legend, he was something more than just a former basketball icon. He was a symbol, a man who had beaten the odds, a millionaire who hadn't forgotten the weight of a hungry stomach or the sting of rejection. Shaq adjusted the collar of his tailored jacket as he strolled down a block he hadn't walked in years. South Central, his old neighborhood. The buildings hadn't changed much, the same weathered murals, the same corner stores. But the faces? Different. Some younger, some older. A few even recognized him, nodding respectfully as he passed, though no one ran up to him. That was the thing about this part of town. They didn't chase stars here. They had seen too many burn out. As he moved past a barber shop, the voices inside carried through the open door. "Man, you remember Shaq back in '94? That dunk he did on Ewing?" "Nah, bruh, that was '95. Tore the whole rim down." Shaq smirked. He could have walked in and said something, maybe even joked about it, but he didn't. This wasn't about nostalgia. It was about remembering where he came from. Shaq paused at an old basketball court, its chain-link fence slightly rusted, the paint on the court faded but still visible. He could hear echoes of his past here, the sharp bounce of the ball, the gruff voice of his stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, shouting at him to push harder, move faster. His childhood had been a constant battle between discipline and dreams. His stepfather, a military man, didn't tolerate weakness, especially not in a young black boy growing up in America. "You gotta be twice as good just to get half," the man would say, his voice like steel against the backdrop of a world that didn't always want to see them succeed. Shaq had been tall for his age, awkward at first. Kids made fun of him, called him Big Dummy in school. He wasn't always the confident giant people saw today. He had to grow into his own skin. Basketball saved him. It gave him a place where his size was an advantage, where his strength wasn't a curse but a gift. It wasn't just a game, it was an escape. And one man saw that before anyone else: Coach Gerald Tate. He hadn't thought about the old man in years, but as he stood there staring at the empty court, memories flooded back. Tate's booming laughter, his tough love, the way he had fought for Shaq when others doubted him. "One day, you're gonna shine so bright, they won't know what to do with you." Shaq exhaled and turned away from the court, his chest tight with a strange emotion. Shaq's journey from that cracked asphalt court to the gleaming floors of NBA arenas was nothing short of a miracle. He had seen the highs: championship rings, MVP awards, millions of fans chanting his name. He had seen the lows: injuries, betrayals, the ruthless business side of basketball. He had made millions, lost some, made more. He had built a legacy beyond the sport, investing in businesses, helping communities, giving scholarships. Yet, even with all of it, something in him never changed. He knew what it felt like to struggle. Not everyone who deserved success got it. Not everyone who worked hard was rewarded. Fate wasn't fair. That's why he gave back. Not for fame, not for recognition, but because he remembered. As he continued walking, he passed a row of homeless tents, makeshift shelters lining the sidewalks, shadows of forgotten lives. He had seen it before, many times, but today, something gnawed at him. There was an old man sitting on the curb, tattered clothes, long unkempt beard, his eyes dull and lost in the hum of the world moving past him. Something about him made Shaq slow his steps, and then, as if struck by lightning, his breath caught in his chest. The man wasn't just anyone. He was Coach Gerald, Tate. Shaq's feet felt like they were planted in concrete. He stared, unable to believe what he was seeing. The man who had once shouted at him to run drills, who had once told him he was destined for greatness, was now just another forgotten face in the city's underbelly. Tate was hunched over, absently tossing a crumpled piece of paper into the air, catching it, and tossing it again, like an old muscle memory of a basketball drill. Shaq swallowed hard. His first instinct was to rush over, to do something. But what if Tate didn't remember him? What if he was too far gone? He took a breath and walked forward. "Coach?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. The old man flinched but didn't look up. Shaq knelt down, leveling himself with him. "Coach Tate, it's me, Shaquille." For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sounds of the city swallowing them both. Then, slowly, Tate's eyes flickered toward him, and the expression that crossed his face was something Shaq would never forget. Tate blinked, his weathered face unreadable. He looked Shaq up and down, as if trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't realize he had lost. His lips parted, then closed again. A dry chuckle escaped his throat, bitter and hoarse. Shaquille O'Neal. The name rolled off his tongue like a distant memory. Well, I'll be damned. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to say something. "Why are you here? What happened?" But the words stuck in his throat. Tate just shook his head, a mix of disbelief and something else flickering behind his tired eyes. "You don't belong here, son," Tate murmured. "You're a star." Shaq sat down on the curb beside him, ignoring the way people glanced their way. "And you," he said, voice steady, "are the reason I got there." Silence stretched between them. Something had shifted, and Shaq knew at that moment that this was only the beginning. Today, something felt different. As he turned a familiar corner near 7th and Alvarado, a cluster of makeshift tents lined the sidewalks, remnants of lives reduced to whatever could fit into a shopping cart. Shaq had seen it before, the way the city's forgotten people blended into the scenery, ignored, invisible. But then, his eyes locked onto one figure, and the world seemed to tilt beneath him. A man sat hunched on the curb, tossing a crumpled-up piece of paper into the air, catching it, then tossing it again. Over and over, like a ritual. His clothes were tattered, his hands weathered with time and struggle. Shaq's chest tightened. He knew that movement, that flick of the wrist. Number it couldn't be. He took a cautious step forward, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The man's face was obscured by an overgrown beard, but the eyes, deep-set, sharp despite their exhaustion, were unmistakable. Shaq felt the air leave his lungs. Coach Gerald Tate. For a moment, Shaq stood frozen, staring at the man who had once been larger than life. Coach Tate had been his rock, his mentor, the man who had seen potential in him when no one else did. And now, here he was. Another nameless face swallowed by the city. Memories hit Shaq in waves. The hot Louisiana gym, the sound of sneakers squeaking against polished wood. Tate's booming voice shouting, "Again! Faster! You're gonna be something, kid, don't waste it!" Shaq swallowed hard and stepped closer. "Coach?" His voice came out rough, uncertain. The old man flinched at the sound but didn't look up. He kept playing with the crumpled paper, as if lost in a trance. Shaq lowered himself, kneeling to meet his eyes. "Coach Tate, it's me, Shaquille." The paper ball slipped from the man's fingers. His gaze slowly lifted, eyes narrowing as if struggling to pull a long-buried memory to the surface. For a second, Shaq thought he wouldn't recognize him. That too much time had passed. Then, Tate let out a dry, bitter chuckle. "Shaquille O'Neal," he murmured, shaking his head. His voice was hoarse, heavy with years of hardship. "Well, I'll be damned." Shaq expected relief, maybe even joy, but Tate's expression was unreadable. His eyes, once sharp with fire and determination, were dulled by exhaustion. The weight of the years hung heavy on him. Shaq exhaled, searching for the right words. How do you ask a man why he lost everything? What happened, coach? The words barely left his mouth before Tate scoffed. You mean what didn't happen? Tate leaned back against the wall, staring at the sky like it held answers. Life. That's what. Shaq waited, letting the silence settle between them. He knew Tate, knew the way he thought. The man didn't believe in pity. He would rather suffer than beg. Tate sighed, rubbing his face. They took everything, Shaq. The job, my home, my damn dignity. His voice cracked on the last word, but he recovered quickly, shaking his head. One bad call, one wrong stand against the wrong people, and that's it. You're out. Shaq frowned. Who did this? Tate gave him a sharp look. You think I don't know how this world works? I went against the system, stood up for the wrong kids, fought the wrong battles. They didn't like that, so they erased me. Shaq felt anger coil in his chest. He had seen it before. The way the system discarded people who didn't fit their mold. A black coach standing up for black players in a league that wanted compliance. It wasn't hard to imagine the backlash. But why didn't you call me? Shaq asked. Why didn't you reach out? Tate laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. Call you for what? A handout? He shook his head. I don't need saving, Shaq. Shaq's jaw tightened. Pride. That's what it was. Tate had spent his life lifting others up, and now, standing on the other side, he couldn't bring himself to ask for help. Shaq sat beside him on the curb, ignoring the stares from passers-by. He wasn't leaving. You don't need saving, huh? Shaq said, leaning back. So what's the plan, coach? You just gonna sit here tossing paper balls waiting for a miracle? Tate smirked, but there was no joy in it. Something like that. Shaq exhaled sharply. Bullshit. Tate raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? You heard me, Shaq said, his voice firm. You spent your life telling me to push harder, to never back down. And now you're sitting here like a man who's already lost. Tate's expression hardened. You don't know what losing looks like, kid. Shaq turned to face him fully. Then show me. Tell me. Because all I see is the man who made me who I am, and I'm not about to walk away like the rest of this city. Tate studied him for a long moment, something flickering behind his tired eyes. Then finally he sighed. Damn kid, still stubborn. Shaq grinned. Learned from the best. For the first time, a ghost of a smile crossed Tate's lips, but it faded just as quickly. You can't fix this, Shaq. Shaq leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Maybe not, but I can sure as hell try. For the next hour, they sat and talked, really talked. Not just about what had happened, but about life, about the game, about the things that had been lost along the way. Tate told him about the nights he spent sleeping on benches, the jobs he couldn't keep because no one wanted to hire a disgraced coach. He spoke about the kids he had once trained, the ones who never got their shot because the system failed them. And as Shaq listened, an idea began to form. A crazy, impossible idea. You ever think about coaching again? Shaq asked suddenly. Tate let out a dry chuckle. Coaching what? The pigeons in the park? Shaq didn't smile. Number real kids. Kids who need someone like you. Tate's amusement faded. No one hires a washed-up blacklisted coach, Shaq. Shaq leaned back, a slow smirk spreading across his face. Good thing I don't take no for an answer. Tate narrowed his eyes. What are you up to? Shaq stood, towering over him. You'll see. Tate shook his head, muttering, Damn kid. But this time, there was something different in his voice. Something that sounded a lot like hope. Shaq had seen a lot in his lifetime. Championships won, battles fought on and off the court. The cruel hand of fame lifting and discarding people like they were nothing. But this was something different. Coach Gerald Tate sat before him, a man who had once stood unshakable, now reduced to a shadow of his former self. The wrinkles on his face weren't just from age, they were from war. Years spent fighting battles no one saw, no one cared to remember. His clothes, ragged. His hands, calloused. His pride, gone. But Shaq? Shaq remembered. Tate blinked at him again, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Shaq could see it, the silent battle waging behind those tired pupils. Recognition fought against disbelief. Shaquille O'Neal, Tate muttered, more to himself than to Shaq. Ain't no way. Shaq forced a grin, trying to ease the weight between them. I know, I got old, huh? Tate huffed, shaking his head. Nah, you got big. Bigger than big. Damn, kid. His voice wavered on the last word, and for a fleeting second, something vulnerable flickered in his gaze. But just as quickly, it was gone. Tate straightened up, pushing himself against the wall as if trying to create distance. What are you doing here? His voice was sharp now, laced with something defensive, something bitter. Shaq let out a breath. I should be asking you that. Tate's jaw clenched. He looked away. Don't matter. Ain't your problem. But it did matter, and it sure as hell was Shaq's problem. You were there for me, coach, Shaq said, voice low but firm. Now let me be here for you. Tate shook his head, rubbing a hand over his face. Nah, kid. Ain't how it works. You don't... He hesitated, exhaling sharply. You don't save people like me. People like you? Shaq frowned. Tate let out a humorless laugh, looking around at the crumbling sidewalks, the people who walked past them, as if they weren't even there. The ones they already threw away. Shaq leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. What happened, coach? Talk to me. Tate didn't answer right away. He reached down, picking up the crumpled paper ball he had been tossing earlier. He squeezed it tight, staring at it as if it held all the answers he couldn't say out loud. Then finally he spoke. You remember that job I had? At Wellington Academy? His voice was softer now, almost distant. Shaq nodded. Wellington Academy was one of the top prep schools in the country, a place where the privileged sent their kids to be molded into future senators, CEOs, and elite athletes. Coach Tate had been their golden boy once, a leader, a mentor, a man respected by all. I was good at it, Tate murmured. Damn good. Had a team full of raw talent. But there was this kid, James Holloway. He paused. You don't know him. Nobody does. And that's the problem. Shaq stayed silent, letting him go on. Kid had talent, more talent than half the boys getting scouted. But he was from the wrong side of town. Didn't have the right last name. Tate's jaw tightened. One game, we were up against a school that had deep ties with the academy. James was on fire that night. 22 points, 7 rebounds. Kid was unstoppable. Shaq already knew where this was going. He had seen it before. But then, calls started going against him. Tate continued, his voice bitter. Fouls that weren't fouls. A charge that wasn't a charge. Refs made sure he was benched by the third quarter. He exhaled slowly. I called it out, loudly. Maybe too loudly. Shaq could picture it. Tate was never one to stay quiet when something wasn't right. They pulled me into a meeting the next morning. Said I was causing unnecessary tension. Said I was disrupting the spirit of sportsmanship. He scoffed. Translation? I made powerful people uncomfortable. Shaq clenched his fists. So what did they do? Tate looked him dead in the eye. Fired me, effective immediately. Shaq's stomach twisted. For standing up for a kid? For standing up, period. Tate corrected. You know how it works, Shaq. Ain't about talent. It's about control. I wasn't playing by their rules, so they took me off the board. The words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Shaq let the anger settle before asking, Why didn't you fight it? Tate laughed, but there was no joy in it. You think I didn't? Tried everything, lawyers, protests. But you know what happens when a man like me goes up against a machine like that? He spread his arms, motioning to the streets around him. This happens. The school blacklisted him. No one would hire him, not colleges, not even lower-tier programs. His name became a whisper, a cautionary tale in backroom meetings. Lost my house next, Tate continued, voice raw. Then the car. Wife left not long after. Guess she didn't sign up for all this. He motioned at himself with a tired smile. By the time I knew it, I was here. Shaq felt a lump rise in his throat. This man had given him everything, and now he had nothing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Shaq straightened. Come with me. Tate's eyes snapped up. What? Shaq gestured toward the city behind them. Let's get out of here. My place, a hotel, wherever. Just not here. Tate shook his head. I appreciate it, kid, but I'm not asking, Coach. Shaq cut in, his voice firm. I'm telling you. Tate studied him, something unreadable in his eyes. Then after a long pause, he sighed. Damn, kid. Still bossy. Shaq grinned. Learned from the best. Tate let out a breath. Fine. But I'm not your charity case, O'Neill. I ain't looking for a handout. Shaq met his gaze. Then don't take it as a handout. Take it as what it is. Tate raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Shaq's voice was steady. A second chance. As Shaq helped Tate to his feet, something shifted between them. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about the future. Shaq didn't know what was coming next, didn't know if Tate would accept the help or fight him every step of the way. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let the man who made him a legend fade away into the streets, not without a fight. Shaq had made a career out of breaking expectations. He had gone from a towering, awkward kid in Newark to one of the most dominant forces in basketball history. He had built an empire, transcended sports, and become a businessman, a philanthropist, a household name. But none of that mattered now. Not the fame, not the money. Because right now, the man who built him was sitting in the back seat of his car, staring out the window like a caged animal, as if he didn't belong anywhere. Coach Gerald Tate was a proud man, and Shaq knew pride was the hardest thing to fight. The ride back to Shaq's estate was mostly silent. The city lights blurred past them, the car humming steadily along the freeway. Shaq stole a glance at Tate, who sat stiffly, hands clasped in his lap. You hungry? Shaq asked, breaking the quiet. Tate exhaled through his nose. I eat. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Yeah? When's the last time? Tate didn't answer. Shaq nodded, already pulling out his phone. He sent a quick text to his chef, telling him to have something ready. He wasn't about to argue about it. Minutes later, they pulled up to Shaq's mansion, a fortress of glass and steel, sprawling across acres of private land. As the gates swung open, Tate let out a low whistle. You always did have a taste for the finer things, he muttered. Shaq smirked. You should see the indoor gym. Tate shook his head, the corner of his mouth twitching in something that almost looked like a smile. But as soon as they stepped inside, that wall of resistance came back up. His eyes darted around, scanning the luxury, the space, the sheer excess of it all. He shifted uncomfortably. Shaq had seen this look before, pride clashing with circumstance. You can stay here as long as you need, Coach, Shaq said, keeping his tone light. No rush, no pressure. Tate's jaw tensed. I appreciate it, kid, but this ain't me. Shaq folded his arms. You don't have to live here forever, just for now, until we figure things out. Tate exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You really think this is gonna fix things? Shaq didn't hesitate. I know it won't, but it's a start. By the next morning, Shaq was already making moves. While Tate was asleep, he got to work. Calls to old teammates, favors pulled from business partners, quiet conversations with charities and foundations that handled cases like this. The goal was simple: get Tate back on his feet. A home, a job, his dignity. But the problem? The man wanted none of it. When Tate woke up to find Shaq in his office, phone in hand, discussing possible coaching gigs, he was not happy. You made calls? Tate's voice was sharp. Shaq looked up. Yeah, you're welcome. Tate's expression darkened. I didn't ask for this. Shaq sighed, placing the phone down. You didn't have to. You need it. Tate scoffed. And that gives you the right to fix my life? Shaq stood, frustration creeping into his voice. Fix it? Coach, I'm trying to help you stand up again. Tate's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice stayed dangerously low. You think a job, a house, a damn paycheck is gonna fix what happened to me? Shaq exhaled, trying to stay calm. I think it's a start. Tate turned away, shaking his head. I don't need your pity, Shaquille. Who said anything about pity? Shaq shot back. You think I'm doing this because I feel bad for you? No, coach. I'm doing this because you deserve better. Tate stopped, shoulders rising and falling. He didn't turn around. Shaq stepped closer, voice gentler now. Look, I know you lost everything. And I know this right here, this ain't easy for you. But coach, you didn't give up on me. Ever. So I'm not about to give up on you. Tate let out a long breath. For a moment, Shaq thought he had won. But then Tate shook his head. I can't do this, kid. And just like that, he walked out. Shaq leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Damn it. He should have known it wouldn't be easy. Tate wasn't the kind of man who accepted help. His entire life had been built on standing on his own feet. The idea of someone else lifting him up was unbearable. But Shaq also knew something else. Tate might have walked away, but that didn't mean the fight was over. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts. He needed a different approach. If Tate wouldn't take help for himself, then maybe he'd take it for someone else. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. Shaq? Man, what's up? Shaq smiled. Perfect. I need a favor. By the time Shaq walked back into the house, Tate was sitting at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee. His expression was guarded, but there was something in his eyes. Uncertainty. Maybe even regret. Shaq didn't call him out on it. Instead, he slid a folder across the counter. I want you to look at this. Tate hesitated, then picked it up. Inside were photos of a rundown basketball facility, kids playing with half-inflated balls, makeshift hoops barely hanging onto rusted poles. There was also a proposal, funding, renovations, a full-fledged training program. Tate frowned, flipping through the pages. What is this? Shaq leaned forward. That's the Eastwood Project, an old gym near Crenshaw. They've been trying to rebuild it, but they don't have the resources. The kids there? They don't have a real coach. Not yet. Tate's fingers tightened on the paper. Shaq studied him. They need someone, coach. Someone who knows the game. Someone who can teach them the way you taught me. Tate swallowed hard, setting the folder down. He didn't speak. Shaq let the silence stretch. Then, quietly, he said, I know you don't want my help, so don't take it. Take theirs instead. Tate's jaw clenched. Shaq could see the war raging inside him, the pride, the pain, the instinct to walk away, and the unbearable weight of knowing that maybe, just maybe, this was his way back. Finally, Tate exhaled. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. When do I start? Shaq grinned. Tomorrow. Tate huffed, shaking his head. Damn kid. Still pushy. Shaq laughed. Learned from the best. And just like that, the game had changed. The decision had been made. Coach Tate was going to rebuild his life, and Shaq was going to make damn sure it happened. But nothing worth fighting for ever came easy. The moment Shaq started putting real weight behind the Eastwood Project, the opposition came fast and quiet, the kind that didn't make headlines but worked in whispers, behind closed doors. At first it was subtle. A few missed calls from sponsors, postponed meetings, lukewarm responses from business partners who had always been quick to shake his hand. Then came the messages, friendly warnings that didn't feel so friendly. By the time Shaq realized what was happening, it was already in motion. Shaq had been in enough boardrooms to recognize when powerful people got nervous. And nothing made men in suits more nervous than the truth. It started with a lunch meeting in Beverly Hills, a sleek restaurant where the forks cost more than most people's rent. Shaq sat across from Richard Langley, a longtime sports investor and one of the major donors behind Wellington Academy, the same school that had erased Coach Tate from history. Langley smiled, all charm, but Shaq saw through it. You know, Shaquille, we've always admired your work, Langley said, swirling his drink. Your brand is clean, powerful. People trust you. Shaq leaned back, arms crossed. Appreciate that. Langley's smile didn't waver. Which is why it'd be a shame to see it complicated. There it was, the warning. Shaq didn't blink. You worried about something, Richard? Langley sighed, setting his glass down. Come on, Shaq. You're a businessman. You know how this works. Some things are better left alone. Shaq's jaw tightened. Like Coach Tate? Langley exhaled, feigning disappointment. That situation, it's old news, ancient history. Digging it up now? That's bad for everyone involved. Shaq leaned forward. Bad for who? Langley met his gaze, the fake warmth disappearing. You keep pushing this, and you might find certain doors start closing for you. Endorsements, business ventures, even some of your philanthropic efforts might stall. Shaq clenched his fists under the table. They weren't even hiding it. You're saying if I help Tate, you'll try to shut me down? Langley smiled again, easy and practiced. I'm saying you should be careful where you invest your energy. Some battles, they don't have winners. Shaq let the silence stretch between them, his heart pounding with restrained anger. Then slowly he stood. Langley watched him with a knowing smirk. He thought Shaq would fold. He thought wrong. Shaq adjusted his jacket. See, Richard, the thing about me, I never needed doors opened for me. He turned to leave, then paused. And I damn sure don't need them to stay open. Langley didn't stop him. But Shaq knew this was just the beginning. 2 days later, Shaq was in his home gym, sweat dripping from his arms as he slammed a medicine ball against the wall. His head was spinning, not from the workout, but from the weight of what was coming. That's when his phone buzzed. Dante Holloway. Shaq frowned at the name. He hadn't spoken to Dante in years. They had been teammates once, rookies at the same time, coming up in the league together. But where Shaq had built his empire on loyalty and business smarts, Dante had gone a different route. He played the corporate game, climbed the power ladder, became one of the most influential sports executives in the country. Shaq picked up. Dante. A low chuckle came through the line. Man, you really don't know when to quit, do you? Shaq wiped his face with a towel. Not in my DNA. Dante sighed. Look, I'm calling as a friend. You're making noise with this Tate thing. A lot of the wrong people are watching. Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. So, Dante said carefully. This isn't a battle you can win. These people, they don't lose, ever. Shaq stared at the floor, anger burning in his gut. You telling me to drop it? I'm telling you to be smart. Dante's voice was firm. You have too much to lose, Shaq. Your businesses, your partnerships. Hell, your entire reputation could take a hit. Shaq's jaw clenched. And if I don't back down? Dante sighed again. Then you better be ready for war. There was a beat of silence. Then Dante's voice softened, almost regretful. Just think about it, man. Some fights, they ain't worth the cost. The line went dead. Shaq sat there, gripping the phone, breathing heavy. He had a choice to make. Shaq spent the next few days waiting for the fallout. He expected calls to go unanswered, deals to start slipping through his fingers. And they did. A major brand paused negotiations on a sponsorship deal. A real estate investment he was planning suddenly wasn't the right fit. A network show he had been working on, put on hold indefinitely. The message was clear: back down, or lose everything. Most people would have folded. Most people would have taken the hit and moved on. But Shaq wasn't most people. So instead of backing off, he doubled down. A week later, Shaq walked into a packed conference room, cameras flashing, reporters buzzing. He stood at the podium, took a breath, and spoke. I know there's been a lot of talk about what I've been up to lately, about who I'm helping, and I want to clear that up. He looked straight into the cameras. Coach Gerald Tate is a good man, a man who was wronged by a system designed to keep people like him out. And the fact that some people want me to stay silent about that? He let out a small chuckle. Well, y'all must have forgot who I am. A few reporters murmured. Shaq continued. I don't do things for money. I don't do things for approval. I do things because they're right. And if that means losing a few deals, a few endorsements, then so be it. The room was dead silent now. Because at the end of the day, Shaq said, voice steady, I'd rather lose everything doing the right thing than keep everything by staying quiet. He stepped back from the podium. and walked off. The press conference made headlines. Some people praised him. Others called him reckless. But the ones who had tried to silence him? They got louder. Shaq's PR team started getting bombarded with anonymous tips about his past, his business dealings, anything that could be used against him. It was clear. They weren't just going to let him walk away from this. And the worst part? Coach Tate saw it all. "You didn't have to do that, kid," Tate muttered one night, watching the news as Shaq's name ran across the ticker. "They're coming for you now." Shaq shrugged. "Let 'em come." Tate exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I don't want you losing everything for me, Shaq." Shaq looked at him, unwavering. "This ain't just about you, coach. It's about everybody they've done this to." Tate stared at him for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded. For the first time, he understood. This wasn't just a fight for his redemption. This was a fight for justice. And they were just getting started. Shaq sat alone in his home gym, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The walls around him were lined with trophies, championship rings, jerseys framed in glass, a shrine to his success. But at this moment, none of it felt like enough. He had built a legacy, fought his way to the top, turned his name into an empire. But now, as he stood in the middle of it all, the question gnawed at him. What good was power if he didn't use it when it mattered most? The war he had started for Coach Tate wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about all the people the system had chewed up and spit out. And now, Shaq had to decide how far he was willing to go to fight for them. Memories crept in, uninvited but relentless. Newark, 1988. Shaq was just a tall, awkward teenager trying to find his place. His size made him a target. Teachers assumed he was slow, kids tested him, and coaches didn't know what to do with him. He heard it all. "You're too big to be graceful. Too soft to be dominant. Too black to be the face of a team." It was Coach Tate who saw past all that, who pushed him, shaped him, made him believe. "Don't let them tell you who you are," Tate had said one night after practice, standing under the dim lights of the high school gym. "You tell them who you are." Shaq had held on to those words for years, and now Tate was the one who needed someone to fight for him. And Shaq would not walk away. Shaq picked up his phone and dialed. "Get the press ready," he said. "I'm going public." His team hesitated. They had already seen the fallout, endorsements pulling away, calls from executives urging him to let it go. "Shaq, you sure?" his manager asked. "This isn't just going to hurt business. This could change everything." Shaq closed his eyes. "Good. Then let's change everything," he said. The room was packed, reporters, cameras, flashing lights. The air was thick with anticipation. Shaq stood at the podium, calm but unshakable. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but none like this. He gripped the microphone and spoke. "I've built my career on loyalty, on standing by the people who stood by me. And today, I'm here to do that again." The room went silent. Shaq continued, his voice steady. "Years ago, a man changed my life. He believed in me when no one else did. He fought for me. And because of that, I made it. But that same man, he was cast aside, erased, all because he stood up against the system." Reporters whispered, scribbled notes. Shaq let his words sink in before going further. What happened to Coach Gerald Tate wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. They made sure he would never coach again. Not because he failed, but because he refused to stay quiet about the way young black athletes were treated. Because he fought for fairness. Shaq looked straight into the cameras. "And now those same people? They're trying to keep me quiet too." The murmurs grew louder. The tension thickened. Shaq's voice didn't waver. "But I don't back down." He took a breath, gripping the edges of the podium. "I will not be silent. I will not let them bury Coach Tate's story, and if that means losing money, losing deals, losing everything, then so be it." And with that, Shaq stepped back. The room exploded. The press conference hit like an earthquake. Within hours, social media blew up. #Justice for Coach Tate started trending. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Some rallied behind Shaq, praising him for putting his career on the line for what was right. Others attacked him, called him reckless, said he was stirring up trouble. TV analysts debated his decision. Shaq is risking his entire empire for a man who's been out of the game for years. Is it worth it? This is bigger than basketball. This is about justice. What Shaq doesn't understand is that you can't fight the system. The system always wins. Sponsors panicked. Calls went unanswered. And then, the threats came. Shaq's team started receiving anonymous warnings. Emails, phone calls from untraceable numbers. People with power were making moves behind the scenes. One message stood out. You keep this up, and you'll lose more than just business. Shaq stared at the words on the screen, his fists clenching. They were scared. Good coach Tate watched the press conference from a small TV in the back of the Eastwood gym. The kids around him, the ones Shaq had brought him in to train, were glued to the screen. The room was buzzing with energy. Shaq really put him on blast, one kid laughed. Man, this is crazy, another said. But Tate just sat there, silent. After the conference ended, he stood up, walked outside and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Shaq had just put everything on the line for him. And for the first time in a long time, Tate felt something he had lost years ago. Hope. The world was watching now. Shaq had made his choice, and there was no turning back. But the people in power? They weren't done fighting. The real war was just beginning. And Shaq was ready. Shaq had always known doing the right thing came with a price, but he had never expected it to come this fast, or this hard. Within days of the press conference, his world started shifting. Endorsement deals that once seemed unshakable suddenly started slipping away. Companies released vague statements about reevaluating partnerships and remaining apolitical. Brands that had built entire campaigns around his name suddenly stopped returning calls. The media twisted his words. Shaquille O'Neal jeopardizes career over disgraced coach. Basketball legend risks everything in controversial move. Is Shaq fighting for justice or just looking for a fight? The headlines painted him as reckless, emotional, unstable. But none of that mattered, not compared to what happened next. Coach Tate was gone. It was just after midnight when Shaq got the call from his security team. Sir, your guest is no longer on the property. Shaq frowned, sitting up in bed. What do you mean, no longer on the property? We checked the security footage. He left on foot about 2 hours ago. Didn't take anything with him. Shaq's stomach dropped. Tate had walked out. No warning. No note. Nothing. Shaq threw on a hoodie, grabbed his keys, and left. Los Angeles at night was different. Quieter. Colder. The city that never stopped moving seemed to slow just enough for the shadows to take over. Shaq drove through the streets, checking places he thought Tate might have gone. The shelter he had found him near, the diner they used to eat at after high school games, even the old neighborhood courts. Nothing. The thought gnawed at him. Had the pressure gotten to him? Had Tate gone back to the streets, convinced he didn't deserve a second chance? Shaq refused to believe it. Then, just as he was about to give up, something clicked. Eastwood Gym. The old run-down basketball facility they had been working to rebuild. The place where Tate had finally started coaching again. Shaq pressed the gas. The gym was empty, the doors unlocked. Shaq stepped inside, the faint sound of a basketball bouncing against the worn wooden floor echoing through the space. In the dim light, there he was. Coach Tate stood at the free throw line, hunched over, dribbling a ball slowly, methodically, as if trying to remember something he had long forgotten. Shaq exhaled, relief flooding through him. Coach. Tate didn't stop dribbling, didn't look up. Shaq stepped closer. Why'd you leave? Silence. Then, a shot. The ball swished through the hoop, clean and effortless. Tate let the sound settle before finally speaking. Because I don't belong in your world, Shaq. Shaq felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had expected resistance, but this was different. You don't belong? Shaq repeated, stepping onto the court. Coach, you're the reason I got here in the first place. Tate scoffed, grabbing the ball as it rolled back to him. That was a long time ago. Shaq crossed his arms. So that's it? You just walk away? After everything we've been through? Tate dribbled again, his movements slower now. You don't get it, kid. Then help me get it, Shaq pressed. Because right now, all I see is a man who gave up. Tate stopped dribbling. His shoulders tensed, fingers gripping the ball so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then finally he broke. You think you can fix me, Shaq? His voice cracked, raw and filled with something dangerous. Anger, grief, exhaustion. You think money erases what happened to me? You think a gym, a job, some new clothes make me whole again? He turned to face Shaq fully now, eyes blazing. I lost everything, my career, my home, my dignity, and I had to sit there and watch while the world moved on like I never existed. Shaq felt his throat tighten. Tate exhaled, shaking his head. I can't be who I was. That man is gone. Silence. Then quietly, Shaq asked, And who are you now? Tate blinked. The anger faded, replaced by something heavier. I don't know, he admitted. Shaq let the words hang between them before stepping closer. Then let's figure it out. Tate let out a weak chuckle. Man, why do you care so damn much? Shaq didn't hesitate. Because you cared about me when no one else did. Tate swallowed hard. His eyes dropped to the floor. You can't save everyone, Shaq. I know, Shaq said, but I can save you. A long pause. Then, finally, Tate nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Shaq helped Tate lock up the gym that night. They didn't talk much after that, but they didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, Coach Tate wasn't running anymore. And Shaq wasn't letting go. This was far from over. But they would face whatever came together. Shaq had spent his entire life changing the game, on the court, in business, in the way he gave back to his community. But this was bigger than basketball. Helping Coach Tate wasn't just about paying back an old debt. It was about rewriting the story. Tate wasn't a man to be pitied. He wasn't a victim. He was a fighter who had been knocked down by a system designed to erase people like him. And Shaq? He was about to make sure the world saw that. Shaq sat in his home office, scrolling through real estate listings. He wasn't looking for a mansion or another investment property. He was looking for something that meant something. Then he found it. Crestwood Community Gym. It had been abandoned for years, a once thriving facility now reduced to broken windows, rusted rims, and peeling walls. A place that had once echoed with the sounds of sneakers on hardwood, and kids shouting with joy now stood silent and forgotten. Shaq leaned back in his chair, a slow smile forming. This wasn't just a gym. This was a second chance. The next morning, Shaq walked into Eastwood Gym, where Tate had been helping train kids for the past few weeks. The place was small, barely holding itself together, but it was full of life. Young players hustling up and down the court, chasing dreams. Tate was at the far end, arms crossed, watching a group of teenagers run drills. He was back in his element. Shaq walked up beside him. They listened to you. Tate smirked. They got no choice. I don't take no for an answer. Shaq grinned. Good, because neither do I. Tate shot him a look. What now? Shaq handed him a folder. I bought a gym, and you're gonna run it. Tate's face went blank. He opened the folder, flipping through blueprints, renovation plans, financial backing, all in his name. For the first time in a long time, he was speechless. Shaq, I don't... He shook his head. I can't run a whole damn gym. Yes, you can. Tate let out a breath, staring at the plans. You really think this is gonna change anything? Shaq folded his arms. I think it's gonna change everything. The renovation started immediately. Shaq poured millions into restoring the gym, making sure it had everything the community needed. State-of-the-art courts, weight rooms, classrooms for tutoring. But he didn't stop there. He reached out to former NBA players, trainers, and mentors, people who had struggled, who had fought their way to success despite the odds. He wanted these kids to see that basketball wasn't just a game, it was a way out. Tate watched from the sidelines, still skeptical. You're really doing this, huh? Shaq laughed. Took you long enough to figure that out. Tate exhaled. You put my name on this place. If this fails, it won't, Shaq cut in. Because you won't let it. Tate didn't respond right away. But for the first time, he believed it. Word spread fast. The news of Crestwood Community Gym's revival hit headlines, but it wasn't just about Shaq's donation. It was about Coach Tate. The story was everywhere. A once-forgotten coach, now leading a new generation. TV networks called it a story of redemption. Sports analysts debated, did the system fail a great man? Social media blew up, turning hashtag Coach Tate into a trending movement. But not everyone was celebrating. The school board members who had buried Tate's career were now being dragged into the light. Old records resurfaced. Emails were leaked. People started asking the question, why was Coach Tate really fired? The very people who had silenced him years ago were now scrambling to protect themselves. And then came the statement. Wellington Academy released a press release calling the controversy an unfortunate misunderstanding from a different time. They claimed Tate's firing had been unrelated to any racial issues and tried to paint him as a coach who had simply lost control of his team. Shaq wasn't having it. Shaq called up his team. Get the cameras ready. We're telling the truth. The next day, he stood in front of the newly renovated gym, cameras rolling. But he wasn't the one speaking. Coach Tate was. For years, I let them write my story, Tate said, his voice steady but full of emotion. They said I lost control, that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't worthy. He took a deep breath. But you know what? They were wrong. The cameras zoomed in. I didn't lose control. I stood up. I fought for kids who didn't have voices, and for that, I was erased. Tate glanced at Shaq, then back at the cameras. But thanks to this man and this community, I'm here today to say, I am not erased. The video went viral overnight. The city rallied behind him. And the school board? They had nowhere left to hide. A week later, Wellington Academy announced a formal apology. But words weren't enough. Under pressure from the public and alumni donors, they had no choice but to offer something more. A full reinstatement of Tate's coaching record, a position on the state athletics board, and a multi-million-dollar donation to Crestwood Community Gym. Shaq watched Tate read the offer letter. Tate let out a dry chuckle. Took him long enough. Shaq grinned. Told you we'd change everything. Tate set the letter down, exhaling deeply. So, what now? Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. Now? He looked around at the gym, the kids playing, the sound of basketballs echoing through the building. Now we build something that lasts. Crestwood Gym opened its doors to hundreds of kids that summer. And at the center of it all, Coach Gerald Tate, no longer a forgotten man, no longer a victim, a legend, reborn. And beside him, Shaq stood, not as a former player, not as a millionaire, but as a student still repaying his greatest teacher. Because some debts aren't paid with money. They're paid with action. And Shaq? He was just getting started. The night air buzzed with energy. The streets around Crestwood Community Gym, now officially renamed the Coach Tate Academy, were alive with excitement. Spotlights lit up the building, camera flashes flickered like stars, and a crowd of supporters gathered near the entrance. It was a night of celebration, redemption, and justice finally being served. For the first time in years, Coach Gerald Tate was no longer a forgotten name. This was his moment. Inside the gym, the atmosphere was electric. NBA legends, Hollywood celebrities, community leaders, all gathered under one roof to honor the man who had once been erased. Reporters swarmed, capturing every second of the event. Shaq stood near the entrance, watching as Tate shook hands, took photos, and laughed. A deep, unrestrained laugh that hadn't been heard in years. Man, look at you, Shaq said, stepping up beside him. Superstar status. Tate smirked. Ain't nothing but a damn gym opening. Shaq chuckled. Nah, coach. It's bigger than that. This is history. Tate looked around, his eyes reflecting something deeper than pride. Relief. He had fought his battle, and he had won. And now? He finally belonged. Shaq noticed something as he scanned the room. The same faces that had once turned their backs on Tate were here now. Former colleagues, old school board members, even people who had doubted Shaq's fight. They were all here, shaking hands, offering praise. Funny how victory had a way of changing people's minds. Tate saw it too. He exhaled slowly. You think they actually mean it? Shaq shrugged. Some do. Some don't. But that don't matter, coach. We know the truth. Tate nodded. He wasn't looking for apologies anymore. He had already won the only fight that mattered. Later that night, after the speeches, the press interviews, and the noise had settled, Shaq and Tate stood alone in the gym. The walls were lined with photos of young athletes, kids from the community who would now have a chance. A large mural near the entrance bore Tate's face next to the words, "You don't let the world tell you who you are. You tell them." Tate stared at it, shaking his head. You really put my ugly face on the wall? Shaq laughed. Had to make sure they never forget you again. Tate smirked, but then his expression softened. You did all this, kid. You made this happen. Shaq shook his head. Nah, coach. You did. You made me who I am. All I did was return the favor. For a moment, Tate didn't say anything. Then, finally, he pulled Shaq into a tight embrace. No words, no speeches, just a moment of mentor and student, now equals. As the night came to a close, Shaq's assistant handed him an envelope. Someone donated a big sum to the academy, she said. Didn't want their name attached. Shaq frowned, opening the letter inside. Some fights are worth it. You were right. Dante Holloway. Shaq exhaled, a slow smile forming. His old rival. The same man who had once told him to leave the past alone had now become part of the fight. Tate noticed the look on Shaq's face. Something good? Shaq folded the letter, slipping it into his pocket. Yeah, something real good. As Shaq walked out of the gym that night, he looked back one last time. The lights of the Coach Tate Academy shined bright against the dark sky, a beacon for every kid who had ever been told they weren't enough. This wasn't just about Tate anymore. This was about everyone who had been counted out. And Shaq? He had never been prouder. Because some fights? They're worth everything. And this one had just begun. Some stories aren't just meant to be told. They're meant to change things. If you've ever fought for something bigger than yourself, if you believe in second chances and unfinished legacies, then you know this fight isn't over. Because justice isn't given. It's taken back. And the next chapter? It starts with you.